Good morning, everybody. Well, it's morning here. It's 6 a.m. here in Hawaii. I guess it's noontime on the East Coast and probably nighttime after work in Europe. So I appreciate everyone that's going to be joining in on the LinkedIn Live and the YouTube Live. I do have a few things I'm going to talk about, but I'll also be taking your questions and comments. We might have a couple people come on live and ask some questions. And I'm going to run this till about 45 minutes after the hour, because at the top of the next hour, I'm actually doing a live tabletop response. And I want to talk to you a little bit about tabletop response. But before we get going on that, we did create a snazzy new opening for the event. So let's, producer Liz, if you could play that opening for us. Pretty fancy, huh? So that was pretty fancy. We had some fun with that. We got a lot of great video from S4X20, so we wanted to include some of that in our show openings, and we'll try to do one of these live episodes every month or two so you can ask your questions. But if you actually want to ask a question on any past episode, we have at dalepeterson.com. You'll see there at the bottom, if you go to dale-peterson.com, you can actually record your question on any one of these episodes, and we'll include some of the ones that are very pertinent at the end of the Unsolicited Response show. So what I want to start out talking about today is actually something that I've been going back and forth with Joe Weiss about, and that's about this level 0, level 1 awareness issues. There's two parts. One is awareness, and one is what do we do with it. So on the awareness side, Joe Weiss has been beating this drum for a while that we need to work on level 0 because there's no security there. And I completely agree. We're in violent agreement that there is no security at level 0, that there's no authentication there. But he presented a couple weeks ago at the SANS ICS Security Summit, and let me put up his quote here. And he wrote in his article summarizing his experience there that there appeared to be a general acceptance that level 0, 1 devices were uncompromised, authenticated, and correct. And that is wrong. So again, no disagreement. That is completely wrong. And especially the authenticated part of it, which leads to the fact that it's insecure by design. There's no authentication. If you send something to a sensor or actuator, or let me take that back. If you send something to an actuator, it's going to do what you send it to do if it's a legitimate command. If you want to man in the middle a sensor communication or spoof a sensor communication, the other side is going to have no idea because there's no authentication of the source or the data integrity. And this is the same issue that we brought up with Project Basecamp at level 1 with PLCs and such. It's something that really is beyond dispute. But what surprised me was this issue that maybe the ICS security community wasn't aware of this. So we went back and forth, and I said, well, why don't we just take a poll? Why don't we take a poll and see whether this is really an issue or not? So let me put up the poll results. So I'm hearing we're having some issues with LinkedIn, but they're going to keep trying. So hopefully our LinkedIn people are getting us, but we will see. Anyways, so this was the poll results. True or false, or the poll question, true or false, communication to and from most Purdue level 0 devices, sensors, actuators, and such, is authenticated. And probably not to my surprise, but we had about 200 respondents, and over 97% of them said false. They realized there was no authentication there. There was no security there. So from my standpoint, that really showed that you could be confident that the ICS security community understood this problem, that they knew that there was an issue there. So then the question is there an awareness problem outside of the ICS security community? And that is less known because I think, for example, if you're someone coming from the IT world, there's a good chance you don't understand this issue because you've never dealt with sensors, actuators, PLCs, and such. You've just dealt with computers, servers, workstations, network infrastructure equipment. So it's not unusual that someone would be very surprised by this fact, but it's something they would learn early on if they spent a little effort. I think the bigger issue is whether the executives know about this. And this is tough because we don't want our executives to have to really dig deep into whether something is actually secure or not down at the sensor or actuator level. That's more detail than an executive needs to have. But it is important that they understand that there's this level of insecurity inside the perimeter because that affects whether the things that they might do would affect risk or not. So a lot of your protection controls that make perfect sense in most networks just really don't do anything in the control system world once you're inside the perimeter. So I think somehow executives need to understand this vague concept, but we don't need to inform them about all the ins and outs of these level 0 and level 1 devices. The thing that I'm a little bit curious about is the engineers. Do the engineers understand this? And I have a bit of I'd call it an awareness gap there because the people I interact with are in the security community. Some of them are engineers, obviously, and they understand this. But what about the engineer who really doesn't view security as their role? Do they understand that this is an issue? So that's still a gap that I don't know. I don't know whether that's there. I would like to believe that the engineers know this. Now, they might not actually understand the ramifications of this, but I believe they know this. And we had someone who wanted to talk about this level 0 issue. So I'm going to bring Ron Fabella on. And Ron, we can talk a little bit about this and ask a question. Let's see. Liz, I think you're going to have to remove yourself. There you go. Ron, welcome to the show. This is always an interesting event going live here. But you had a couple of thoughts and questions. What were your I guess concerns or questions on the level 0 issue?
It's tough because I think we all know and respect Joe and his position on this. What confused me with his position in his blog yesterday is the connection between a lack of awareness and then a lack of care. And I think to kind of rewind on all of this, the burden of proof is on the claimant. So Joe is claiming that the security community maybe isn't aware, which I think was a shock to anyone in the security community. And so maybe we're missing some definitions. Maybe he doesn't see engineers as part of the security community or owner operators as part of this kind of bubble that we live in, which may be fair. I think events like yours and just progress over the last decade has broken that barrier. So I think it's no longer a supportable claim. And
well, what about just stop there for a second? So, I mean, I have this issue because I don't want engineers to have to think a lot about security. So I don't really want them to be this part of the security community. I want them to be aware that they need to follow maybe some recommendations that the vendor provides and such, or things that their OT staff provides. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. The vendor has a huge part in this. And I think what we've seen over the past, decade is product security in the vendor space is getting a lot of attention. But it comes down to whether the owner operators actually have a refresh cycle to bring in new gear or put funds in procurement to secure features, which we've seen lags in the community. In the same way that when I get on an airplane, I don't have to know the engineering behind lift and thrust and everything else. I trust that engineers have built this. I think what I take issue with Joe's latest position is not so much that that these things matter to security, to engineering, to whoever. It's the lack of care. His title was lack of authentication does not appear to bother people, and I'm not sure where that's coming from. So again, to continue on the analogy, the 737 Max issues, as a as a person who travels, I was aware and I took care of that, but it wasn't necessarily my responsibility. And I think maybe to your point is that the security community for the past decade, even longer, has had to prove that this is an issue that requires care and awareness. And we've done that. We can't force OEMs and engineers to implement just because we think it's important. I'm just confused as to how, or maybe why, Joe is making this leap and kind of moving the goalposts, right? He said, hey, he makes a statement. You said, well, I'll go collect some data in a very analytical approach. You came back and said, well, overwhelmingly, 97% have said, no, we're aware of this problem. And he goes, no. Who did you ask? Yeah. What did you ask? Like, and so I don't want to make this,
Yeah, let's move on from there, because I think that awareness is one thing, okay? And he might have a valid point about not caring about the issue, because there's so many things we can do, right? There's so many potential risk reduction activities that you could do, both on the likelihood and the consequence side. And when I'm looking, for example, if I take the extreme example of a sensor with no Ethernet port and no IP routable stack that has no security, I acknowledge that that is an issue and someone could spoof sensor data. But on my list of things I would do, it is extremely low.
Right.
I don't even know if it would make the list on a normal asset owner. Even if I had unlimited resources, I'd get down to the point where I'd say most of these I'm not going to bother fixing that problem. So I do believe he places a higher priority on that in his analysis of risk reduction achieved. So I think there is some disagreement there that he points out when he says people don't care. I have to shrug my shoulders. Yeah, there's a lot of level zero I don't care about when I'm looking at risk reduction. So I think that is where the disagreement is. And then the harder thing is, for those places where we do care, what do we do about it?
Right. Yeah. Where's the actionable path forward? I think also I do this as well, where you forget that all of this is a moving target on the engineering side, both from a safety and process efficiency, from the security side. So it's not a static list where you can say, well, we've done items 1 through 9, and now item 10 are all of these level 0 sensors that we don't care about. That's just not true. There's always going to be more added to the stack. As they move to cloud, as they move to virtual, as more modernization occurs, it's always going to be backburnered, and for good reason. And this is where, while I haven't been part of official HAZOps and layer protection analysis type of assessments, the link that I think the video that I saw on LinkedIn a few days ago is perfectly clear that it's a conversation, and you can't always implement full 100% protections. It's about probability. It's about impact. And to your point, some of these sensors that either they're redundant sensors, they're not IP enabled, or they're even sensors that aren't on the critical path for the process. Obviously, those would be put on the back burner from a upgrade, modernization, security, protection, the whole kit and caboodle. And I think that's okay. I trust that the engineers in the process are making these decisions in the same way that aeronautics, they're making these decisions. They're making these trade-offs for the best. And who am I to question that as a security person?
Well, I guess I would, as a security person,
right?
Because I'm not sure that they really understand it sometimes. An analogy I have sometimes is, you go into a site and you'll say, what would be something really bad that would happen? And they would say, oh, this thing could heat up or these things could mix together,
Right.
causing an explosion. And you say, well, how are you stopping that? And they say, we have soft interlocks in our PLCs that prevent that. It's like,
Right.
okay, that's good, but what if I reprogram your PLCs? So
Right.
I think there's a certain level of, let's say, they lack the creative attacker thinking of what someone could actually do. So
Yeah.
I think we do need to inform them a little bit about that. And this is tough because my article next Tuesday is supposed to come up with some solutions. And I'm trying to do this. And I'm almost thinking you got to separate greenfield and brownfield, right? So if we've got new level 0 devices and existing level 1 devices with Ethernet cards and IP stacks, well, they should have some level of security in them. And we need to get that into the products as soon as we can. I don't think that's controversial. They should have signed firmware. There should be some authentication on the protocol. There should be maybe 2 levels of users, your administrator and your operator, your engineer and your operator. So I think there's some basic things there that, unfortunately, when you're buying a system today, you a lot of times don't have that choice.
Right.
So we got to solve that. But then you go look at the legacy, the brownfield stuff. That's where it gets really hard. And I've got some ideas there, but you really, I think it's almost 2 things. You have a set of ideas, and then you have to have some decision tree in terms of, let's say, risk associated with that level 0 device. So I was just thinking on some of the places I've visited for low impact level 0 devices. So I've been to a place with a tank farm where they get the tank level reading sent in real time, but they have someone physically go to the tank and measure it every day. So if it's wrong, it's no big deal to them. They're going to know that. If you look at meters, let's say the home meters, your gas, your electric, your water meter, almost every one of your agreements has something that says that they can do estimated billing based on your past use. And they have programs that are looking for wide variances in that.
Well,
so
you're,
in that
you're
case,
touching on a great point, right? Not only are there process and procedural, we can roll a truck and go look at your meter, especially for like more industry, but there's redundant sensing. If they don't know how much my home is using specific, they can see at the relay level at my local substation that power is still flowing. Or they can look at the house, the next down the line and say, well, we lost Ron's house. Is the next one, I'm in a rural area, I'm on a single phase string. Was the one further down still on? Okay, we don't have an operational impact. This is just an efficiency impact. It's not critical to that process. And I think if you look at both green, brown, and kind of the risk assessment process, these are not single points of failure nine times out of 10. If they are part of that HAZOP LOPA process, they've determined that it's so not critical that it can be single threaded, that not everything requires a safety system or protection. And so to your point, I think we've made strides. It almost feels like we're talking, and Ron's kind of hitting it here, where Ron Brash, this is what we talked about 10, 20 years ago. And maybe we're on old thinking. And I think both from the operator, engineer, vendor stack, we haven't been giving them a lot of credit. Just because there's low adoption doesn't mean that we haven't been aware and making strides to at least level the playing field and make these things available. Let the owner operator make that risk assessment and say, well, greenfield or not, we're not going to go with these new security features. So I think that's where I take most issue is I don't want to really have the community get into this same quagmire approach of, well, if you Stuxnet style the sensor, then bad things happen. As a pen tester in my early days, I used to get that all the time. It's like, all right, Ron, you walked into the substation, you shut the substation down. Just go flip the relay. Go shoot the transformer. Yeah. I used to get the hunting rifle and the chain over the buswork, right? And so while that upset me as a pen tester, it made sense because it was a process and risk-based view of it. And
that's a really important point is when you're looking at anything down at a field site, especially in the SCADA world, if you can do the same thing physically, then you really have to look at, is it worth addressing the cyber risk? If the bad guy is locally in the system, he can just flip switches, smash things, unplug things, do things like that. And that's a much easier attack. Now, we did see, if you think of Sistrunk and Crane's Project Robust, where if you got physically into one of those and then you could go back and attack the control center, then that's a risk that we need to worry about, because you can do much more damage from an unmanned remote site than you could at that site.
And as I matured as an attacker, that was the so what analysis, right? As you interconnect these remote sites, I can do a one-to-many attack, right? Which raises a lot more attention, which is why naturally I think that was a talking point that your CISO, that your plant manager understood. They said, well, why does a substation need to talk to another substation? That was just something those IT guys put in and didn't think of the process. And so that's why you saw focus on the network layer protections or the network layer monitoring or things higher in the stack. It wasn't to protect everything at the level 0 level. It was to prevent those one-to-many attacks. And I feel that was an appropriate first step, right? Because the catalyst was there. Hey, we connected things that weren't previously connected. So we should probably start by monitoring and protecting those connections. So it's.
Yeah, you laughed at this, didn't you? I had about Marty's comment. Good one, Marty. There's another category, though, that I saw actually almost 8 years ago now, but it's much more IoT related or IIoT related, is that we're also starting to bring in more information that is just nice to have information.
Right.
For example, what I saw was it was a utility that wanted to bring in some pole top data, and they hadn't done it for decades because it was too expensive. And this was back when Verizon was beginning to offer their cellular data service. And they said, hey, we can stick one of these Verizon devices out there. We can bring that data in. They added security to it to protect the inbound, the control center itself from bad attacks. But they said, if we don't get that data, if there's a denial of service, we don't care. We don't have it today. If it's wrong, we don't care. We're not going to rely on that. It helps us with our efficiency, with sending out repair groups and things like that. It provided nice to have information. And I'm thinking that a lot of these IoT devices are going to fall in that category where, yeah, we'd like to have the information that makes our world better, but it's not a critical incident if it's lost or wrong. And that's going to be something that's going to be a little different for this industry to deal with.
And that's a great point. And this happened, of course, my view is biased on this, but when the ARRA grants came out for smart grid and modernization of the grid, that was an initial easy win, quick value, was both on the AMI and the smart meters, but then also on the line monitoring, volt var. And again, it increased that awareness. But as long, and this is the big comma, but as long as that data isn't being used to do control decisions, then you're okay. Like you said, it's just general awareness. It's like me knowing that, the temperature outside is a certain degrees. Now, if I'm turning my AC on and off based on that, then that may be a problem. But I don't think a lot of utilities, process, et cetera, they know where that division is. And they're making those risk-based assessments. Like, do we set up our own cellular networks? I've worked with a lot of utilities that tried that with the old census days, right? And I think with IIoT, and whatever we're going to call it next decade, it's just bringing that technology both miniaturized, easier to deploy, easier to manage. And so why wouldn't you get more data out of your grid and process networks?
Yeah. I think the hard part, though, is that, so again, if you look at the analog stuff, it's like most of it isn't going to matter from a risk standpoint. If you look at the stuff with Ethernet or IP stack, that stuff, the problem is if we hand wave it's not critical, then we're unlikely to get anything in there. and
Right.
and in a perfect
Right.
world, yes, it's not critical, but it's there, and there's some basic level of authentication, and that's the hard part. Is we can push it down and say, yeah, it's not as important, but then we'd still like to see new devices be deployed with something. So it's a tough messaging sometimes.
It is, and to completely contradict myself, it wouldn't be there unless it was critical to some process, right? At some level of criticality. We tend to use these absolute terms, critical, not critical, or supporting the business. You do risk assessments, you give these labels. It's kind of like what I call the crown jewels fallacy, right? Well, out of your 20 power plants, which one is the most important? Well, all of them, because people don't run power plants unless they need the power. You don't run the processing, at least you need the output. And so, but when you get down to this macro level, these nice to have sensors, awareness, etc. Again, as long as they're not, and this is where I'm stepping out of bounds in my experience, as long as the operator is not making process or control decisions on those nice to have sensors, then let them go to the cloud, let them grab their phone and see it while they're walking around the yard. Like I honestly don't see a problem with that. Um, so I
Okay, let's bring up one more question, then I'll let you go here, Ron.
Awesome.
Let's see. I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but as we move forward with IoT, is this going to become largely self-correcting as we engineer redundant sensing as backup for everyday boring engineering, programming, remote command mistakes? I guess my thought on that, I'll let you give yours too as well, Ron, but my thought is that would address non-intentional issues. So, and that's the problem that we have with a lot of these things in the ICS world, is there's a tremendous amount of redundancy in the system, and a lot of times this has been used to say we don't need to do anything because if this fails, that works. But of course, if it's a cyber attack, it can take up the primary and the redundant. And we see this affect, or at least I do see this affect asset owners in a lot of ways. For example, they don't typically do as good a job on backup and recovery as they should, because they just always assume if this one fails, that'll work. But if you say, when was the last time you actually brought your system down and figured out how you're going to bring it up, or what's your recovery time objective, they don't tend to dive into that because of what this question was. Did you have any last thoughts on that or anything else before I let you go here?
Yeah, we definitely don't want to create false excuses not to keep progressing with security, because I think security is resiliency, and resiliency is where everyone wants to move forward. And sometimes that is done by vendor diversity or sensor diversity, having multiple secondary, tertiary backups. I've also seen where sometimes those backups are overutilized, like being at a utility and say, we don't have any wireless. So what's this wireless over here? Oh, that's that backup, just in case the MPLS ring goes down. Well, okay, it's always on. So we have to be very intentional about our messaging when it comes to this. And I think with the level 0 conversation, we mix way too much, as opposed to awareness versus care, critical versus non-critical. Everything's a gray area. And unless we're partnering with the actual owner operators and engineers, to your point, they don't have to understand this fully. Like I don't have to understand the process exactly, but unless we come together from a point of respect, we're going to stop the progress that we've made.
Okay. Well, great. Ron, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good day.
You too.
Oops. Okay. Thank you, producer Liz. I keep counteracting your commands there. I should just keep my hands off the controls. That's what they always tell me in the control room, too. So the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit today, because actually at the top of the next hour, I have a tabletop exercise for incident response. So one of the things I thought might be interesting is to talk a little bit about tabletop exercises, and I'll tell you my two favorite. I'd be curious if you out there have any favorite tabletop exercises, as well as we probably have a couple of minutes left for additional questions if you want to bring up a different topic as well. So producer Liz will keep an eye on those for me. So the tabletop exercise I'm doing this morning is one that I think really every asset owner should do, and that's, of course, ransomware. Ransomware getting into the control system, getting into your level 2 computers and maybe some of your level 1 panels and that sort of thing. This is a great tabletop exercise because it actually will test recovery for a lot of incidents. So it tests the basics. Something bad has gotten into my control system, and I need to figure out how to get it out and how to recover. And it tests all sorts of decisions. For example, when you can start recovery, what you do for containment, how do you know you got it out? It really will test almost your whole process. And one of the reasons why it's so appealing is that ransomware has such mind share today that it's not difficult to convince your audience, the people involved in the incident response, that it's something that potentially could happen. If you have some doubts, you can point them to news articles where it has actually affected production. It finds a way to get in. So I think this is a really good exercise. I will tell you, in my experience with these tabletop exercises, if the organization does not have an incident response plan and a playbook and has not trained on it, then you need to treat this as just an awareness exercise. Because if people think they're going to be judged on how they respond, it becomes very adversarial. So you just treat it as an awareness exercise, and it almost, I guess the primary purpose of it is almost to make them understand, hey, we need to work on this. Hey, we maybe need this playbook. Maybe we need this list of data sources in advance. Maybe we need to understand what containment activities are pre-authorized and who can do them. So you get this list of things and an appreciation for the process. As you move on, if you move on to let's say the next level, now you have a plan, you're testing on it. Now you're ready to actually run a real incident response tabletop exercise. If it's the first time you go through it, you should go into it thinking there's going to be a lot of failure. Again, it's almost like the first time you audit a security policy. You're going to have maybe 50% level of people not doing what they're supposed to do, even if they've been trained on it. And you're also going to identify places in your playbook that are just completely impractical. I see this a lot of time with time periods where some decision is supposed to be made within 2 hours and it involves a lot of data collection and analysis, and it's just not possible. So then you start to say, well, in the real world, we're not going to be able to meet this. What are we going to do? And you tend to rev your playbook. The next one you do, so let's say you have your plan in place, people have been trained on it, you've gone through it once. The second one is where I really start to judge the effectiveness of it and the people's performance, because by that time you should have worked through the issues and you should be ready to go. So that's my general approach. I will tell you the other tabletop exercise I really like for the ICS world is what I call ops down. And this is a good one because this is the case where operations has gone down and you don't know if it's a cyber incident or not. Being cyber related is one of many possible causes. And quite frankly, in this world today, it's not a likely cause. So every time ops goes down doesn't mean you should necessarily launch the ICS cyber incident response plan and the ops down playbook. You would have criteria that would launch it. So you start to go through those decisions. When do we start to look at whether cyber is a cause? And how deeply do we look? And what do we do to look at this? And who do we bring in for this? And I found that playbook has been much harder than the incident response playbook, but it also addresses a large group of possible incidents. Because we're seeing this today. We're seeing more often than not when things are, I shouldn't say more often than not. That would be wrong. I would say occasionally we're seeing asset owners start to at least ask that question when something happens. Was this a cyber incident? Now, of course, the press is asking this question anytime the power goes out in India or something. They say, "Was it a hack?" Uh, and we know for the most part there's very little evidence of this. It's just a nice story. But in general, we should be looking at that. So that's my rant on tabletop exercises. Liz, did we have any questions or comments that we should address here that you want to put up? I haven't been watching those as closely as I can while I'm talking. Let me take a look at this. I'll put a couple of these up here. Ron Brash, very active. Yeah, Ron, I see that. I don't know, though. Do you really think that the whoops is going to get any larger? I'm not sure that it would get larger. I almost wonder if we have more data coming in, if the chances of a single point of bad data causing a problem is going to be as large. One of the issues, or one of the things that I'm really hopeful about, and I've mentioned this before in addressing these problems, is this issue of process variable anomaly detection. And we saw this with, if you Google GE Digital Ghost in S4, you'll see the video on this as an example. But as we see these digital twins created, they now have essentially a model of what's running in the plant itself. They're getting all the data, they're able to run it, and they can do calculations to say, does this make sense? And the example I saw was, for example, if someone presses the accelerator down, is the engine revving up? Or if the accelerator is not pressed down, is the engine revving up? And you can tie various sensors and actions with each other, and you can say, wait a minute, I see what the data is saying, but it makes no sense. So as we have more data points, and as we combine these data points together in our model, we can start to say, this data I'm seeing is not right. And what Digital Ghost actually was doing was it was identifying where sensor input seemed to be wrong and was actually going back, and the digital twin or Digital Ghost was feeding that information back into the control system, where it could either pop up a screen and say, this does not appear to be right, or it could actually put it in the model. Not the model, but it could put it in the actual control system and say, throw out that bad sensor data and use this correct sensor data. Now, this could be useful for cyber attacks, obviously, because if someone then is going to want to fool the system, they're going to have to insert bad data in a lot of different places, and they're going to have to do that in a really intelligent way. So something like Stuxnet might be able to pull that off, but you're just not going to be able to spoof a little bit of sensor data and fool the system. In fact, even today, I would argue that a lot of operators would identify spoofed sensor data or bad sensor data. Because remember, sensors can send you bad data, not just because they're being attacked or spoofed, but because the sensor went bad. So that's another possibility. So these things that we're putting in place for security will also help deal with any issues that you might have from bad data coming into your system. Well, with that, I think I'm going to actually close down this live event. This is always a challenge. We're still trying to get the kinks out of this, so I appreciate all of you that were listening. We're going to put this up on the site, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and we'll put it out as a podcast after we clean it up a little bit. But thank you, Ron, for being on the show. Thank you, everyone who's been commenting. And next week's show, I'm actually going to be, I believe I'm going to be talking with Jason Christopher about his new risk framework. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. So that's it for now. Everyone, have a great day.